Bookstore, author and book, where we're going to generate bookstore. And we'll also create a bookstore feature module for the bookstore functionality. And finally, we'll update the root app module to include and display a placeholder for the bookstore data. All right, so that's what we're going to be doing in this video. Let's get to it. All right, so we want to generate, this is the first part. We want to generate our store component, right? Now, whenever we have a component, we can certainly do it just like the PowerPoint show and just do it by hand. But I like to do it by generating the component automatically. So one of the ways to do that is use the NGGC method. And we want to target a folder, and it doesn't exist right now. We're sitting in, notice we're sitting in week 8. Week 8 is like way out here. Okay, we don't want to be in there. We want to go into our client. Okay, and in our client we have the following folders. We can see that we have E2E, node modules, and source. Let's go into SRC. And here we have our app, our assets, our content, and so on. So we want to go into our app. And inside of our app, we want to target a new folder. Now notice I went several layers deep. I could have gone right from the client folder and then just specified exactly where I want it. But here I'm just closer to where I want it to go. So it's going to be our bookstore folder, and it's going to be a store folder for our bookstore component. We could call it the bookstore folder because maybe we'll have more than one store. We'll have some other store as well that we're selling things. But let's just call it a store, I guess. So we're going to say NGGC. Okay, and it's going to be inside the store folder. We're going to call a new component bookstore. Okay. Now this is going to be different than what we see in the PowerPoint, because the PowerPoint we just call it sports store, but it keeps sports and store separately. It actually will create a thing called store.component.ts in the PowerPoint. Here we're going to call it book-store. You're going to see how it does it. It's also going to make a brand new subfolder. So be careful how this works. So store and then bookstore, that'll make a subfolder, and it'll also add it in automatically. So we're going to have to go back and do some manual manipulation of this after. But it makes it quicker when we do it this way, as you'll see. Enter. So let's see what happens. So it did its thing. So it made a new store folder, and inside there, it created a new bookstore folder. And inside the bookstore folder, it nicely placed bookstore component, bookstore component.html, bookstore component.ts, which is where we want to be. So this is what we would have to generate on our own, right? In the PowerPoint. Now this is divergent from what we did, what the PowerPoint shows. It's book-store component, but I want to show you how to connect to it, and it's not that entirely different. Just the pathing might be slightly different. Okay, so let's just go here, and we're going to say inside of our bookstore component, which is inside the store folder. Okay. Could we have done this differently? First of all, if I had wanted to make a store component and made the bookstore object inside of there, we could have. I just could have called it bookstore, and it would have made a book-store folder. I mean, that could have been something we could have done as well, instead of having a separate folder. And maybe there's not going to be anything else in there. So how do we correct that? This is the questions I always get asked. Okay, so Tom, yeah, this is great. You made this, but it's wrong. How do you fix this when it's wrong? And I just did something wrong, right? You're going to say yes and no. We did something wrong, but remember what this does. As soon as we make a component, and if we look at the store folder, where we have our bookstore subfolder, what does this really do? Well, in the app module, right, it automatically added this bookstore component in there, which is what we want. We want the bookstore component to be there, right? Bookstore. And it also linked it, store, book, bookstore. See, it did that. So we could like actually leave it the way it is. But if all we want is a bookstore component inside the app module, right? And it's going to be in its own folder. We can change this a little bit. Let's just change this so we can undo it. And this is the way you would undo. You can't, you can remove a component, but it's just easier if you do it like this manually. And one thing is, sometimes it's better. All right, so we removed it this way, and we want to go back out and undo our work. That's okay. So we can kind of right click here and we'll just click delete. So we'll just delete that, move it to the recycle bin and do it again. So let's clear the screen and let's be more strategic this time. So we'll say NGGC and then we'll just call it bookstore. Okay, so notice I'm using capital bookstore. I'm naming it. I'm not using component. And if I just did this and press enter, it's going to make a brand new folder called bookstore. There we go. And notice what it did. It made the bookstore component kind of in its own. And this is what it kind of did. We also have this one. And if let's refresh, make sure that this is set up correctly. One thing that we have a problem with sometimes is that Visual Studio won't delete stuff. So what we want to do instead is, if I go to my desktop and if I look at Comp229, let's go into week 8. And if I look at the client folder, we can still see under source app that there is a store and bookstore. We don't want both these because it'll cause a problem. Let's just get rid of this manually. Sometimes we need to do that. And it's not a big deal. It says you'll provide administrator rights. Yes, go ahead. And the reason why I couldn't is because unfortunately what's happened is our app is open and probably one of these things has our bookstore in it. So if we just, first of all, let's go into this and close down our app. So we're going to stop formatting it or watching it. Let's see if that's good enough. Sometimes that is good enough to do it. If I try again, it'll do what it's supposed to do. Sometimes we just have to close down Visual Studio Code and then we can do it and it'll work. Okay, so that's not a big deal. So there's a bit of a block there. Now let's go back in there and start it up again. So now we have what we wanted. We have bookstore. You can see that now, now what happens is we have our new bookstore component, but it's in book-store. And this is the standard way that Angular likes to create components, book-store, if it's called bookstore. That's okay to me. I'm fine with that. Bookstore and then bookstore component is inside the bookstore folder. If you really don't like this and you don't want to use this strategy, you want to use something else, you can always rename the top component. But I don't recommend it. Leave it alone. It's not going to kill you too much. And I think this is pretty much what they wanted anyway. Okay, let's get into our bookstore component and modify it. So now that we have only one single folder and not many folders. So our bookstore component, it does a couple things. We need to get our book, import, and we're going to look at book, and then from, and it goes dot, and then up to our model, and inside our book model. So that's the first thing. We want to get our book model because we need to have access to what a book is. Import also, we want to get our book repository. If we did that, sometimes when it's linked in properly, it's really cool that we did this. We can also grab this and put this in the correct order. I like putting it in the order that I want, not the order it tells me to. So again, book and book repository, that's pretty cool, right? And once we've got those things, notice that we've also got an HTML, a default HTML file for this, right, for the bookstore. And then what we have is a store component or bookstore component, which is right there. And it's got an on init, which is not something that the PowerPoint had, but that's totally cool. We don't care about that for now. What we want in this case is just a private repository, which is of type book repository. Okay, so that's the first thing. We make a link to the book repository. That's important. And then a couple of methods. We're going to avoid the ng-on-init for now. ng-on-init, remember, it triggers when the class is started. And also, I don't like the curly brace up here. I could probably change the linter so it doesn't give me, it creates the, the style. When I create my stuff in Angular, it creates my templates the way I want them. I like my curly braces on separate lines if possible. And why? Because then I can wipe this out or comment this out, and I can add a new one, and I can still have the code block. That's why. All right. So in here in our class, not only do we have ng on init, but we also are going to have, because that's required because it's implements on init by default. All right. But we're also going to have our two getters, get products, which is going to return a book array. And what this is going to do is it's going to return this dot repository dot get products. And you're going to say, wait, get books. Which is like, wait, what do we need this, as a getter when we can go directly to the repository? Well, the thing is, you can't go directly to the repository. Repository is our middleware, if you will, that connects to our bookstore, our static data source. That's the model, right? So the model's separate from our bookstore, and that's what's happening here. Okay, next, what we want to do is we want to also use a getter for get authors, and we want to return a string array of all the authors only. So we want to return this dot repository dot get authors. Okay, that's what this does. So that's what this does right here. Pretty simple, right? Excellente. All right, so pretty simple stuff. In the HTML file, which is where we're going to have our template data, what we're going to do is we're going to wipe this thing out, and we're going to say that we want a div with the class of container fluid. Container fluid is different than container in that it hugs right to the edges of our screen, and it doesn't give us a lot of it gives us a lot less margin on the left and the right side. Inside that, we want a div with the class of row. This is all Bootstrap stuff. And inside that, we want a div with the class of column, and then background dark, and then text white, which creates a style for the nav bar. And you know what? We don't need that nav bar. That's going to be our nav bar. We're going to have a nav bar, so we don't need this part. So we can avoid that. But we do want, let's back out a little bit. We want, instead of a container fluid, a new div with the class of row text white. And that is going to have our, inside that, we're going to have a div with a class of column 3 and background info, and P2, which is going to be a style that we're going to use for our categories. And then next to that, so plus means go on the same side as a sibling. Next to that, we're going to have a div with a class of column 9 and background success. That means it's going to be green. So background info is, I believe, gray. Background success is green. And P2 is our style. Okay, and then we're going to press this and just generate it. That's what it does, right? So pretty cool. We have our div tag in there, another div tag in here. So these represent the two columns. So 3 columns and 9 columns for a total of 12. That's how it works, right? So here we're going to use our mustaches. And mustache notation, this is where we're going to inject stuff. We're going to say authors.length. Wait a minute, how can we get authors.length? Well, because authors is actually being injected into the component, right? We can see that in here, we're injecting the repository, and what we have is both the authors and, because we're getting that from our repository, right? Repository itself is of type book repository, right? So it includes, notice that there is no authors up here, but we have access to it because why? Well, if you look at the repository, let's go to definition for a second. If you look at the repository, in the repository, we have access to authors. There's authors, and this is wrong. This should be books, actually. So let's go to definition. And the repository. So that was a mistake. Let's go back in there. Instead of products, and I'm looking at the repository for the data source. So we have books and authors, get book, get authors, and I believe in the static module. So this is static data source, get books. Okay, get books, where is it? Get authors, get books. Here's the model. Where is that? Is it here? Authors and products. So this shouldn't be products, this would be books. All right, that's what that is. So that's inside of our component itself, right? So books and authors, there we are. So we want to get the authors count. So if I go here, now this is funny. You might say, wait a minute. Don't we have to use the calling notation for the books method? This isn't a books method. This is a getter, which means we don't have to use the open bracket, close bracket here because this is a getter, not just a method. So here we can say authors length because we're going to go to the component. We're going to say authors, which is of type string, a string array. The authors.length. All arrays have a length property, and we're just getting the length of this one. And the same thing goes with our books. So we're going to say books.length. How many books do we have? As an example, and that's really what we're going to have. So authors and books. Okay, so how many books do we have? How many authors do we have? And that's what this little thing is going to do for us. Okay, so that's pretty much what we want to do. Now, what we want to do is we want to update the model, right? And we're going to create basically a module for the bookstore. And this is something we don't have, and it's not generated for us. We can generate a module by hand, but I'm just going to do it here by using a new file. We're going to call this the book-store.module, just to keep it in line with the same syntax, different than the PowerPoint, but in line with what we're doing here. If we're going to use book-store, we're going to use book-store everywhere, not just in one place. Here, what we want to do is want to import ng module, which is from the @Angular core, right? As well as the browser module. Browser module, remember, is a platform. Browser module, which again is from Angular. And it's a platform browser. All right, and then we're going to import our forms module, which again is from @Angular forms, @Angular forms. And why is that giving me an issue? Did I do it wrong? Oh, we have to use from. How about that? From @Angular forms, and import the model module, and that is from our model. So it goes to / model and then model module, right? So we're kind of incorporating the model module in there. Okay. Now it says that model module is declared, but its value is never used. Of course not yet. And we will get there. And then we'll go to the bookstore component, which is from / bookstore and then bookstore component. Okay. So that is everything we need to create a little module, a feature module for the bookstore, so we can use it everywhere. All right. Then what we want is we're going to say @ng module, and inside ng module we're going to say imports the model module, and the model module is basically going to the browser module as well as the forms module. So again, these are things we're going to be importing into this or including or packaging up with everything here. Then from a declarations perspective, we're going to declare the bookstore component. Okay. As finally, we're going to, as an export, we're going to export the bookstore component out of here, okay? And finally, we're going to export this whole thing as a class called the bookstore module. Okay, bookstore module. Okay. So again, one of the things that it says here is that model module has no exported module member model module, right? So be careful what it says. We could maybe have maybe it's called something else. We call it something else. Let's look and see what that's called. We call this the book module, right? Instead of the model module. Let me see if I did that incorrectly in the last thing we did. And again, I just want to stay so that I called it the book module, and it should be called the model module. Let's just change that name right now. And that's not a big change. That's just here. Model module, and that's going to take away our errors. That's from last video. All right, so it's a typo. So let's go back into the bookstore module. You can see that here we have this part, and we're good to go. We're going to save it. We're also going to do an ng serve minus option open, which is going to hopefully, we're going to do this in the client. Which is going to open up going to compile everything, and hopefully we're going to have no errors in a second. So that's the first thing we want, because if we have errors, that would be a bad thing. Okay, cool. We're going to get back to this in a sec. And let's make sure we don't have another one open, which we certainly do. We don't need both of them, we just need one of them, so we can close one off. And we're going to have one there. Refresh, we can see that this is all still going, and we're going to put in our stuff for our book list in a second. All right, so we're still good, and let's make sure we finish this part off. I know this might be a little bit confusing to you, but what we want to do now is we want to go into the what we've done is if we've done most of the legwork for the store module, bookstore module, and we want to go into our app.component.ts, this one, and our app.component.ts does a couple things. We're gonna in our bookstore, normally what we do in our HTML uses right now on the PowerPoint, it says let's put in our store in here. That's what it's called, bookstore, right? Because remember that in our bookstore module component, we're going to have the component is going to be called app bookstore. Notice that is what it's called, app-book-store. We're going to use routing for this instead of the way it's being done over here, because what's happening in here, our app.component is just replacing our template URL with just the bookstore if all we want to see was the bookstore. That's not all we want to see. We want to see more than that, so this won't work for us. We're going to come back to this in a sec. All right, and then in our declarations, we're going to declare a bunch of different things, right? In our app.module.ts, you can see that we're definitely going to add our bookstore module. We don't have that here. Notice that we have our app routing module and our app component. Here's our app component, followed by we're going to have our app. Under our app component, we're going to put our book module. And we're going to get this from /bookstore/bookstore module. Okay, so it says book module. If you'll hover over there, it says book module is declared, but its value is never read. And what we need to do is I think it's called Bookstore module. Let me just go back here. I'm getting confused. Bookstore module. Yeah, I'll be okay. Bookstore module. It doesn't know Bookstore module. So there it is. That's proper. Bookstore module. And what we want to do is in the imports down in here, where we have our browser module and our app routing module, we're also going to put our bookstore module. Bookstore module. Okay, now save. Now that's going to recompile. We're going to be good. So far, so good. But then we're going to get to this. It says an error. The component bookstore component is declared by more than one ng module. Okay, so that's something we have to be careful about. Bookstore module is here. The bookstore component is used here. Bookstore component, because this is how we generated the component here. And we also generated the component in our bookstore module. Here's our bookstore component. So we can only have it in one place. So we don't need it down in here, right? So in our app module, we don't need our bookstore component. So we can get rid of it this way. And then of course, once that's gone, we also have to get rid of this, which should alleviate this issue. Let's try it out again. And as we save, we should see okay. And that's the next, so that's the first one. So the next one, it says bookstore component is declared here, appears in the ng module exports of bookstore module, but could not be resolved to an ng module component directive or pipe class. Is it missing an Angular annotation? Bookstore component implements on init. All right, and again, it says that it appears in the ng module imports of the app module, but itself has errors. So we have to step this back up. So it goes. So again, whenever you look at this, it tells you where the errors are. So just to show you this, so and it's kind of hard to see because it says is listed in declarations of the ng module bookstore module. It's listed in this one, and it says it's listed in the declarations, but it's not directive, a component, or a pipe. Either remove it from the ng module's declaration or add an appropriate Angular decorator. All right, so what does this mean? So that means that in the bookstore module up here, right, bookstore module, the bookstore component is what it's complaining about. It's saying bookstore component is declared here, where it's in the bookstore component, right here, right here is the bookstore component, but we're using the on init. It says, but we're actually not using it for anything. So let's get rid of this part first because our bookstore doesn't use on init, and we'll save it. And then, okay, now the next one, it says that so we compiled, but then the last error is it appears in the module ng module imports of app module, but itself has errors. And it says, but it did compile successfully. Source app bookstore module.ts. Bookstore module.ts. Okay, cool. So bookstore module, bookstore component, exports bookstore module. So what could be the problem? What could be the problem? All right, again, this is me monkeying with the code, right? Because I want to show you that you can do different things. You don't have to follow the PowerPoint exactly. All right, so let's trace it. So again, bookstore module is here, right? So we declare it bookstore module here as an import, okay? So that's how it works. So first the bookstore module comes from book-store module. So let's go back to there, book-store module. Book-store module has bookstore component, this bookstore component, right? And it's complaining about the bookstore component. Let's go back up and make sure that the component is set up correctly. So I'm just going to scroll back up on my data. So bookstore module, looks like the model module is here. Browser module, forms module is good. The bookstore component and bookstore component is here. This is good. And I just want to make sure that my bookstore component is laid out appropriately. So bookstore component is where probably the issue is. Yeah, let's get rid of this. We don't need this right now. Angular core. it's book from the book product, book repository, app bookstore. Fine. And then we have our HTML, we have our CSS, we don't care about that stuff. We have an app component, decorator, we have an export class bookstore component, and what else? Store component, a private repository with books and authors. Okay, let's save that. Bookstore module. What could it be? Bookstore module says, okay, source app. Did I save everything? Oh yeah, it says one unsaved. Ha ha ha. I bet you that's what it is. All right, well, that's possible. That's the first thing is I always try and save everything. And that usually a lot of times it saves or hides on this kind of stuff, but it looks like there is a problem. It says compiled successfully, but there's an error in bookstore module. It says, now this is something else. It tells you where it is. It says it appears in the ng module imports of app module, but itself has errors. Okay. I don't see an error in bookstore module, but let's see if there is an error. Maybe I missed it. Some kind of error that I don't see here. And let's take a look here. I'm just going to go over my bookstore module and make sure that it's good. So Angular core, browser module is platform. We got Angular forms, model module. We're good to go with our model module. Our store component, bookstore component, that's okay. And we have imports, our model module, browser module, forms module, and our bookstore component. And exports is bookstore component. Our class is bookstore module. Why is that? Yeah, see? Like I said, maybe this wasn't saved, so now it's fine. Hooray! That's the first step, like it's figuring out what the errors are. All right, next, after this is all good to go, we can't see it, right? Why? Because there isn't any link to it. And what we need to do is we got to figure out how this works. So remember that we have something different about ours that's not the same. And what we have is inside of our partials, we want in our header, let's go to our header HTML. We want our home, about, product, services, and then we have our book list. We've kind of commented this out in preparation. We want to uncomment it now. We want to put that book list back in place. And that's going to be our link, book list, right? And inside of our router module, which is our app-routing.module, we have home, about, product, services, and then we have our book list that's missing. Notice that, again, if I was going to split the page a little bit, like this, in our header component.html, it's right after services. Now, I don't have to put it in any particular order. It doesn't really matter here. But for completeness, I'd like to put it in the order that I have it here in my navigation. This is just me. All right, you may not decide to do this. So what I want to do here, and this is important, because notice that I'm going to use it, but I don't have it listed here, and I can totally list it in a second. You'll see one way of doing it is actually just typing it in. So say path, right, and it's book-list, the book list. Our component we don't have, which is our bookstore component. Bookstore component. And then our data, we're going to pass in a title of bookstore. Okay, so that's what it's going to be. And then what we need to do is somewhere up here, our bookstore component is what we need to put in here. So we're going to import our bookstore component, and we're going to say from / bookstore, and then / bookstore component. And when we did this, now you can see that this all highlights, it looks all nice. And we have our routing for everything else. So now our routing is linked to our book list. And if we go into our link there, we can see that we have a books. If I click books, we have authors and we have books. And we show that there's 4 authors and 15 books. Whew, we're exactly where we should be, except that I'm not really a fan of this layout exactly. and I'd rather have this layout be a little bit different than this. We're going to come back and we're going to monkey with this layout later on, but for now we've done everything that we need to do to add in a books link here without making it the only thing we can see. So we can see all our routing is here, and we have books in there as well. All right, so that's really the end of this video. Let's just recap. We did a lot here. We made some mistakes. We corrected some mistakes too. So here we created our whole book module, and we did this by auto scaffolding it by generating it, right? And then we added our module. Now, a feature module, hopefully you get the gist of what a feature module does now. A feature module takes a bunch of stuff. We can have more than one component. It packages it up and exports it. We have more than one component in here. We could do that. We could export more than one component out from the feature module into the main module, our app.module, and then we don't have to list it in here. So, question for you. Could there be a module that we could use, and this is a question for another video, so we can get rid of all this noise? There's a lot of noise in here, right? Header component, footer component, home component, about component, all this component stuff. Could we make a feature module that incorporates all of this, and instead of us having to export all individual components in here, then we just can import the module? Where would we put this module if we were going to make it? And well, if I just answer some of the questions I'm just asking, we could, because we have a partials folder, we could in the partials folder make a new module called the partials module. You could do that, right? And same thing with pages. In the pages component and pages folder, we could make a pages folder. So in our pages folder, our pages module. So we have a pages module and a partial module. Those things would connect everything up, and then we could export them as feature modules inside of our app module. Now we won't do that here. I'm just mentioning it as a topic of a future video, but it's something that we're definitely going to do to optimize our app module. And why would we do this? Because then it would look cleaner, and also we could add things to a module, and once we insert something here, anything we insert into that module gets automatically inserted in here. So for example, if I modify my bookstore module now, I don't have to modify, I could modify pages and it wouldn't matter. This doesn't care. It would just import the entire bookstore module with whatever modifications we had to it. So it's compartmentalizing or splitting up our application into features, which is kind of cool. And there are different features here. We have a header footer feature, right? Partials, a partial feature. And we also have a pages feature, all the top level pages that we have going on, which is pretty cool, right? So that's something that we could do differently. Okay, that's it for me right now. Again, we'll stop this video, and then when we come back, in the next section, what we really want to do is we want to add more store features. We're going to add our book details, all the book details. We're going to kind of display all the book details in all of their glory. All right, see you in the next video.